So I have two questions.
Yes.
The first is, a while back, you mentioned that without God, there would be no sense of right or wrong.
There might be a sense of right and wrong, but there'd be no objective right or wrong.
Okay, so what do you have to say about the notion of God's arbitrarity? For example, if God tomorrow, if we had some kind of miracle, and God said, murder is, I love murder is good.
Yeah.
Would you be a murderer?
Excellent question. In fact, this is sometimes called the Euthyphro dilemma. Have you heard of this? You have? You rock. Okay, because many people haven't heard of the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma is in a Plato dialogue where there's this character Euthyphro, and the question is asked, does God do it because...
Is it pleasing to God, or is it pleasing to God because it is good?
That's right. That's right. And it's supposed to be a dilemma. You know, when God does it, is it good? Or does God have to look to a standard beyond himself and say, oh, that's good, that's what I'm going to do, right? In one, if God has to look up, it makes God not God. There's some standard beyond him, so you don't need God, right? Or in the second, God's arbitrary. As you said, tomorrow he says murder's fine. Okay, it's fine. And this is supposed to be a dilemma, but it's not really a dilemma. Why? Because a true dilemma is A or non-A, right? In this, you have option A, option B, maybe there's an option C. There is. What's the third option? God doesn't look to a standard beyond him. If he has to look to a standard beyond him, he's not God. That's God. God isn't arbitrary. He just doesn't make things up. The third standard is, or the third option is, God is the standard. God is the standard of good. The buck has to stop somewhere. It stops with God's nature. He doesn't look beyond him. He doesn't invent things. He is the standard. So there's no way God could ever command that now murder is good. He is the standard of good. Does that make sense?
Can you explain some more?
Well, what more context do you want? God is the standard of good.
He can't do anything against his natures.
Yes, he is the standard of good. Now, he can do things that, since he's the creator, if he wants to take our lives, he can. It's not murder for God to take our lives. Right? When somebody dies, does God murder them? No. In fact, people never really die if you think about it. If the Christian worldview is true, people don't die, they just change location. They change from here to the eternal state. And God can take people from here to the eternal state anytime. 2 years old, 82 years old, it's up to him. That's when you talk about all the Canaanites in the Old Testament and all that. God can move people from this life to next life anytime he wants.
Right, I'm not really concerned with that. Just let's say, for example, if God said tomorrow that rape would be okay.
But he wouldn't, because he is the standard of good.
But how would you know that he wouldn't? Because just because you claim that he's the standard doesn't necessarily mean that he still can't be arbitrary. Because if all the good and bad things had to be created at one point, that means that they essentially could change if he so choose.
God doesn't create good and bad. He is goodness. And any deviation from his nature is what we call evil. In fact, evil doesn't exist on its own. It's a privation in good. Augustine had a problem years ago. He had a problem he couldn't solve. And the problem went this way. God created all things. Evil's a thing. Therefore, God created evil. And he puzzled over that for a long time until he finally recognized that the second premise of the question, or the second premise of the argument, was false. Evil's not a thing. Evil is a lack in a good thing. Evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of the car, you got a better car. If you take all the car out of the rust, you got nothing. Evil is like a rot in a tree. If you take all the rot out of the tree, you got a better tree. If you take all the tree out of the rot, you've got nothing. A totally moth-eaten garment is a hanger, right? It doesn't exist. So evil doesn't exist on its own. It only exists as a lack in a good thing, which is why Satan metaphysically is good. He has good qualities. He has mind, emotion, and will. He has power. That's good, but he uses it for evil purposes. So God isn't arbitrary. He is the very standard which helps us understand what arbitrary is. You see, if there wasn't an immovable standard, we wouldn't even know what arbitrary was. We wouldn't even know what random was. Because random or arbitrary only makes sense against a backdrop of stability.